You know how you've heard me complain about how crowded the parks have gotten these days, but there's a great way to see a park from a unique vantage point, away from all those pesky crowds. And it's refreshing. So today we're going to raft the Colorado River, but not through the Grand Canyon. We're going through Canyonlands in Utah. And if you find this is something you want to do, it's a heck of a lot easier to get one of those permits, or find a spot with a tour company. And remember from the Sophie Diaries, when I was out west myself, my hike through Canyonlands was one of my most impressive of my whole almost 2 months in the desert Southwest. It's gorgeous. So today we're going to go rafting and hiking 6 days through Canyonlands National Park with my good friend Sherry Ott of O.A.R.S World. Not only is it easier to arrange a rafting trip through Canyonlands, but also this is a much shorter duration, unlike going through the whole Grand Canyon, which might take you a couple of weeks or more. Which frankly is a long time to be in a raft. So actually this trip appeals to me more than rafting the Grand Canyon. So let's get started. Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures Podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. And today we brought back Sherry Ott of O.A.R.S World, whom if you follow the travel blogs, I'm sure you know her from there, but also she was our guest who taught us about hiking the Kamano Kodo in Japan, as well as St. Olav's Way in Norway. I'll put links to both of those in the show notes. Sherry has traveled the world over and does the most amazing and unique experiences, so be sure to check out her blog to see all these crazy things that she's done in her lifetime. And she is also a very accomplished photographer. Not only do you get to read her stories, but you get to see some great photos. As I record this, I'm still on the road with Sophie, and trying to do a podcast while on a road trip has its challenges. Recording today's episode was probably the most challenging of any I've had so far. But I'll leave that story to the end of the program, so be sure to listen out for that as I pull back the curtain so that you can see some of the foibles, laughs, problems, and craziness that goes into putting on this show for you. It was quite the interview. But now, let's start our conversation with Sherry. Welcome to the program, Sherry. How are you doing?
I am great. How are you?
Wonderful. So, Sherry, my first question for you is, you've been all over the world. You've done everything, and time is precious. So what was it about doing this trip that appealed to you? Why this trip? What made it special?
Oh, gosh. I think personally, anytime you get to get on the Colorado River, it's special. So, but this trip, basically, it starts at Moab. So that's a great starting point. You can obviously go early, see some of the parks, see Moab. But what this does is it takes you through Canyonlands National Park, which is a huge park that very few people see much of. So this takes you through the heart of it, all the way through to basically where Lake Powell begins. And we've been hearing so much in the news lately about Lake Powell and how it's really getting smaller and smaller. And so this, I think it's a very special trip to be able to go through a canyon that very, very few people get to go through, see a part of a park from a perspective that few people get to see. And it's 6 days of just being outdoors, camping and rafting. And it's a pleasant trip. I loved it.
Now, so that we can tell whether you can compare or contrast, have you ever rafted through the Grand Canyon?
Yes, I have. I'm probably one of the few people that have. So last year during the pandemic, I actually took advantage of some of the cancellations that they had. And I got on a last minute Grand Canyon trip where I went 11 days through the Grand Canyon, also with the same company. And that was spectacular. So yes, I found myself comparing and contrasting these two trips all the time. And they were both great, but I'm happy to talk about the differences because, as you may know, to get on the Grand Canyon is very hard in the sense of it costs a lot of money and there's a long waiting list. So that's why I went last year during COVID. To get on Cataract Canyon, there is no waiting list, but it has a lot of similarities and some also really cool, unique differences. So it may not be Grand Canyon, but it has some really cool things that you can do that you cannot do in the Grand Canyon.
So maybe before we get into the details of your particular adventure, how about giving us a little bit of the comparisons and contrast between the two rafting trips?
Gosh, the first thing I think of is, I mentioned already that it's easier, you don't have a wait to get into this. So it's easier to book. But the main physical things are the color and the temperature of the water is way different, even though you're both, you're on the Colorado River. Cataract Canyon obviously comes before you get to the Grand Canyon. And it is the river's natural color, which is really at that point very brown. It looks very brown and muddy in all of my pictures. But that's the color of the Colorado River. Whereas I'm sure you've seen pictures of the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River, people rafting through it, and it looks like this brilliant green, which it is. But that is because that water has my understanding is it has a lot of algae in it from coming through the Glen Canyon Dam. So it gets all pooled up there and comes through the dam. Another thing that causes in the Grand Canyon, not only just the color of the water to be green, but it also means that the temperature of the water is very different because it's pulling that water from the bottom of Lake Powell, which is much cooler. And so the temperature of the water in the Grand Canyon is normally right at around 50 degrees, which is pretty chilly. And that doesn't change really throughout the year. It can be 115 in the canyon, outside, but that water is 50, which can be good and bad, right? The other thing is the flow of the water is completely controlled in the Grand Canyon because of the dam, whereas Cataract Canyon or the Canyonlands, that part of the Colorado River, first of all, the temperature varies quite a bit. I think for us, I went in June, so not the heat of summer, but it was already at 65, 68 degrees. So much more pleasant to swim in and just be in general. And then the other big thing is that the fact that there is no control of the flow of that water prior to Glen Canyon Dam. So in this trip, it varies wildly as far as the flow based on time of year, rainfall, that type of stuff. So I chose to go at the beginning of June. And normally the end of May, beginning of June is the melt season for the mountains in Colorado, and all of that melts in. And that's the high season, the high water flow for the Colorado River at that time. So I chose to go during quite a wild time, but that changes throughout the summer depending on when you book it. So those are probably the biggest differences, I would say, between the two, I think.
So is this a trip, if you want to go in the high flow season, you should have some experience?
You need to be experienced, without a doubt. They normally say that they're either class 3 or 4, I think, throughout the summer, which I would say they're probably more like 3, especially because, like I said, we've been hearing about the drought, so the water flow isn't as heavy, but still during the melt off, they will get as high as 3, 4, 5, I suppose. They've seen 5 there. But I would say most of the stuff that we went through, I can't remember exactly what the flow levels were. They always tell you that, but they're numbers that don't always mean a lot to me. But I would say they were probably class 4. The biggest ones were class 4 for sure in June, and they might have even been a little bigger at the end of May. It really does vary. If you go, say, in July, August, they're going to be more like 3.
And if you're not familiar with the rafting grades, they go from 1 through 5, 1 being so mild it's like a bathtub. 2s are bumpy, not really scary. 3, you're getting some excitement. 4, you're getting a thrill. And 5, you could die. My personal preference is for 3s with some 4 thrown in for the thrill. So basically, if you have the experience and you want a wild ride, you go early in the season. But if you're inexperienced and want to have the feel of the rafting adventure without getting all twitchy and scared, you go a little later in the season.
So if people are inexperienced, yes, I would say later in the season. So July, for sure, August, September, those would be greater times to go. The other really nice thing about this particular route is it's great for families. I was going to say, I was actually on an all adult trip for this trip. They have different kind of times of the year where they do that. And specifically for big water, that big water season, they might make it all adult. But other times of the year, this is a perfect family trip. So if you have kids that you want to take along and, camp and so on, it's great. The other thing that makes this really kind of a great beginner trip is, and it's very different than the Grand Canyon, is the first 4 days of the trip is flat water. And I mean flat water. I mean, there's a current, but there's no rapids whatsoever. So you start out from Moab and you're floating through Canyonlands National Park for 4 days. And what you're doing, you might go, well, wait a minute, that's a rafting trip. That's not a rafting trip if you don't go through rapids. But it is, because you stop, you go on hikes, you see petroglyphs, you learn about the history there. And then the other beautiful thing is that makes this very different from any other rafting trip I've ever done is you bring along stand-up paddle boards and inflatable kayaks. So during that flat water days, you can be out paddle boarding, you can swim, everyone jumps off the boat and swims. It's really fun and kind of calm for the most part. And then it's the last 2 days where you get all the rapids at once. So that is also a little bit different than the Grand Canyon, where you constantly have a flat section and then a rapid, a flat section and a rapid, and you have rapids every day. So this is kind of a fun one and a great one for families in that way.
How about describing the canyon? What are we going to see?
So the canyon is really beautiful and it changes kind of as you go through it. I am no geologist. If you are into that, it's beautiful. So it really changes because you kind of have this, what do I want to say? Just more kind of wide open, the river is wider at that point in the beginning for those 4 flat days. There's not as many, say, like slot canyons, but there are plenty of places to hike. And then as you get down into where the confluence starts, so the confluence is the intersection of the Colorado and the Green River, which is a huge confluence in the whole, what do I want to say, in the whole idea of the Colorado River. It's one of the biggest ones. So once you get to that point, like the whole geology changes and everything gets more narrow. And so what happens is you've got twice the amount of this water because you've got the 2 rivers coming together, funneled into an even narrower space where the Cataract Canyon starts. And that's part of the thing that makes it so interesting. So there you have really high canyon walls. You get those, beautiful red rocks. You can see millions of years of layers of rock. You get more slot canyons that you can hike back into, more of that kind of traditional canyon area. So you really kind of get 2 different landscapes, I would say. And then even beyond the rapids and beyond what I would call Cataract Canyon, which is those 2 days of rapids, then you really get into where Lake Powell technically starts. And that in and of itself is pretty interesting too, because you can see where they flooded it. All of a sudden, the bottom of the river's like shoreline where we're camped becomes really silty, because that's what, Lake Powell, everything kind of just flows in there and then sits. So it's a bunch of different types of landscapes, I would say, from really tall canyon walls to really more wider kind of open spaces. And then you get into Lake Powell and there's really no shoreline anymore because it's all flooded and you're right at, the canyon walls.
So when I was doing my research for today's show, I saw referrals to something called the big drops. What are those?
So once you get to the rapids on those 2 days, there's 3 very kind of the big drops. There's 3 actual rapids that are named Big Drop 1, 2, and 3. And they're all quite technical. Of course, you have a good guide that's doing all of the work, quite frankly. So for me, it just meant that it was a more fun ride. You get more wet, you get thrown around more, you have to move around more in the boat and follow the instructions and stuff like that. For the guides, it's a lot of technical maneuvering. But for each of those, for Big Drop 1, 2, and 3, we would get out and we would park all of our array of boats, because we did have a whole array of boats, which I can tell you about, on the shore. And then we would hike over to where you could see the actual rapid. and all the guides would kind of talk through it. This is where their real work came in. They were working the whole time, but this is where their technical rowing work came into play. So they would look at it and decide the lines and see, because with the river really kind of always changing in flow, every time they come down that river, even though they might have been down it 50 times, it changes. And so that changes the lines that they have to go through. And it's really fun for me. That's one of the things I love about these trips, is you get to kind of learn about that. So that's fun. The rapids were really great. And then there were a number of other rapids, obviously. They all have different names. I can't remember them all. But depending on the level of difficulty of those, they would let us actually get out the little inflatable kayaks and take kayaks through them. And that was crazy. It was definitely a highlight of the trip for me. It also ended up being one of my more scary moments. But yeah, so that was fun. So you were going through, like, I would say, class 3 rapids in little kayaks, and they were all there to support and rescue you and all of that stuff too. So the rapid section was really fun. And that was one of the things that made it very unique. When I referred to the kayaking through the rapids, I had a really interesting, I should say, I had a really kind of scary but good experience in the kayak. So I'm going to back up to when I did the Grand Canyon. We actually had inflatable kayaks along, and they let us do a few of the rapids, the easy ones. And when I was in the Grand Canyon, I did a couple, and I really pushed myself on a few of them because I was scared. I mean, it's very scared. It's a whole different perspective to be at that water level, sitting in the water and going through these rapids. And I haven't necessarily been trained. I mean, I do a lot of kayaking, but not whitewater kayaking. So, I knew the whole idea is keep your kayak pointed perpendicular to the waves coming at you. And we would follow the boats through. So I did that in the Grand Canyon, and I really loved it. It turned out to be kind of a highlight for me in the Grand Canyon. And so one of the reasons I wanted to take the Cataract Canyon trip was I knew they allowed these inflatable kayaks. Not only do you get to have them for the 4 days on the flat water, but avoiding the really big rapids, they will let you take them on some of the class 3, class 2 rapids. So I decided to do it on our last day of rapids. And I was in a single kayak. That we also had doubles too. But I was a solo traveler, which, by the way, this trip is awesome for solo travelers. Any of these multi-day rafting trips, I think, are awesome for solo travelers. But so I was a solo traveler. I was in my own kayak. It happened to be really windy that day. And we took off, and, we put the kayaks kind of in the middle of our whole array of boats so that we can follow the front boat through, kind of follow their line through. And also, if something happens, they've got people, down water, down current to pick us up. And I got through the first rapid. It was crazy. I mean, I was terrified. Like, I had my GoPro on, recording it all. I know I was talking to myself. It's a lot of work to try to keep that kayak straight. And because it was so windy, it made it that much harder. So the wind was blowing upstream. And in fact, on that first rapid, it was blowing so hard upstream that when I got through the rapid, I couldn't even get into the eddy to get some stillness. And I was fighting and fighting and fighting to get in the eddy, and I just couldn't. And I looked at the guides, and they said, go on. They gave me the signal to go on. And I had to go through the next rapid all by myself without following anyone. So I was already pretty worked up, but I made it, and I felt really good. So when you challenge yourself and you survive, it's always a great feeling. I would say then we came to, I think it was rapid 29, and it's called the Chutes. I'll never forget it. I was following one of the dories through, one of the boats through, and I was doing okay. It was rough. I was doing okay. And all of a sudden I had a big gust of wind blow me, and it kind of blew me sideways. And I was trying really fast at that point to right myself so that I could get perpendicular again. And I looked over to my right, and there's this big wave that's just coming, and it sideswipes me and turns over the kayak, and out I go. And I'm in the middle of this quite long rapid. And so immediately, I always think, how many of these safety talks have I sat through in whitewater rafting? I mean, a ton of them, right? And you always think, am I going to remember what I'm supposed to remember if I have to? And luckily, I did remember most of it. I got out from under the kayak right away and I held on to the kayak because as long, that's a great flotation device. I remember them always saying, and I had my paddle for some reason too. But another big gust of wind came and it flipped the kayak back over on top of me again. And when I got back again from under it, I lost it. I couldn't hold on to it anymore. So now I'm just floating and these waves are big and I'm trying to remember like when to take my gulps of breath. I got to say, it was pretty scary. But I also knew that I had all these boats downstream and they were watching me and, yelling for me and so on. So I actually had my GoPro on this whole time. I wasn't thinking about that, obviously, but it was on top of my helmet and it was recording. So I actually have a whole recorded, like 4 minutes of this. It felt like about 4 hours, but it only took about 4 minutes. And eventually I missed one boat, but then the second dory actually picked me up and everything went just as it should at that point. Getting back up into a boat from the water is not easy. I mean, they have to pull you up and over the side of a very high boat. And so that part's pretty gruesome, but I made it and I've never been so happy to hit that bench of the boat and be in that boat. I was exhausted, very happy for my skilled guides. Yet I was also pretty happy that we had a really wild ride.
That's a scary kind of type 2 fun. Do you think you'll ever kayak in rapids again?
Yes, and I did kayak the rapid again. I actually ended up, after I caught my breath, they got my kayak. There were 2 other kayakers also that dumped over in that same rapid behind me. Everyone was rescued in different boats. And they're like, do you want to get back in? And I thought about it and I'm like, yes, because if I don't get back in, I'll never do this again. And so I did. And I was really freaked out. I was tired, but I did. I got back in and I finished off the rapids that day. I think we had like 3 more. And I was so determined. It was just one of these really great experiences overall, though, that reminds you of how strong you really are and how important it is to challenge yourself, because if you don't challenge yourself, you don't really grow. And I think that was my big lesson from it. So it all worked out. And I don't think that would, that happened to me because I chose to go in the kayak. You don't have to. But it's nice to know that, all of those rescue talks and all the safety talks, they are really on top of things in those rivers and in the rapids. I was so impressed by our guides.
So you've been mentioning all the different ways you're able to get down the river. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So another thing that made this unique, not only did we take stand-up paddle boards and inflatable kayaks on this trip, but we had a variety of paddle boats, really. We had your regular, what you would call a O.A.R. raft. So an O.A.R. raft is what they take down the Grand Canyon too. It's one guide that's doing the paddling with 2 oars, and then normally 2 to 3 people or 2 to 4 people, guests, that sit in and basically just hold on. That's all you do is hold on. You don't have to paddle or anything like that. And they're super fun. In big rapids, that's the way to go. However, so I think we had one of those, only one O.A.R. raft. We had 2 dories, and dories are kind of I'm going to call them the Porsche of the boating, of the rafting world. So ours were actually aluminum, but they're normally made out of wood, and they're kind of high. They're very high-sided. They're a performance machine, basically. Once again, you have one guide with 2 paddles controlling this dory, and you've got 4 people holding on. But it really is the difference of, like, I don't know, driving an old truck or driving a sports car. The dories are a sports car. And you talk to the guides who know how to maneuver these dories and take them through the rapids. And it's really cool. They talk about them so poetically because it's an art for them. And they operate so smoothly for them. But they're also like, if you're a little bit off, it can mean a disaster. But if you're on, it's perfect, like on the right line and so on. And so they have a responsiveness that the big oar rafts don't. So I had never actually ridden in a dory before, but I tell you what, I actually took some footage just of being in the front and the back of the dory. It's a whole different kind of ride through the rapids than a regular oar raft. So I believe O.A.R.S, which is the company I went with, is the only company that'll take dories down the Cataract Canyon. And we had 2 dories. And then we also had a paddle raft. So a paddle raft is one of the kind of more typical things that you would think of in whitewater rafting. You've got a guide in the back with 1 paddle doing the steering, and then you've got like 6 guests with paddles on the side paddling along, following the instructions of the guide in back. So we had one of those, and that was also taken through, which you don't see that on the Grand Canyon. You don't have that option on the Grand Canyon. They're just too big of rapids. But on Cataract, you can. And then we also had a motorboat along, and it was a great big, I think they call it a U-boat, a big U-boat. And they have that because oftentimes in the flat section, or also for sure when we get into kind of the Lake Powell area, we called it barging up. They bring all the boats together and, kind of tie them up together. So you're one big barge, and then the motorboat pushes you through, because that's the only way you can kind of do this in any quick amount of time to make it a 6-day trip. But because of that too, you've got so much room for gear and supplies. Like, that was the interesting thing. Even though you're camping for 6 days out in the wilderness, I mean, it's kind of like luxury camping in a way, the way you eat and the types of stuff you have with you, because they've got all this room in all these boats where they can bring it. So the boat variety is really unique for the Cataract Canyon.
So what's the day itself like? How much are you in the raft?
So each day we would raft for much of the day, and then split that day up with hikes and then other things we would be doing on the water. So each day we would get kind of a breakfast call, probably around 6 or 6:30 in the morning. Breakfast would be served up. We would slowly, it was very leisurely. I loved that part. We would slowly kind of tear down our camp and so on. And we would normally get on the river, somewhere around 9:30, I would say. And we would float and, like I said, kayak and sup and swim, whatever we wanted. And then we would normally pull over for a hike. The hikes that we happened to do on this one were shorter than what I did in the Grand Canyon, I would say. But that's okay, because we could do multiple ones during the day. One of our hikes was to petroglyphs, which was really cool. Some really pretty lookouts where you could see all the different layers and millions of years of rocks. My favorite hike, I don't know if it had a name, but it was this part of the river that's so cool because it's this huge S and tight S curve, right? So, which there are a lot of in the Colorado River. I think we always think like, oh, Horseshoe Bend. I mean, everyone talks about Horseshoe Bend in the Colorado River. That's like one minor little bend that everyone can see. But like the stuff that we were in the canyon, there was this, like I said, this super tight S curve. And we got out in the beginning of it, and we ended up hiking kind of over and then up and over the saddle, because it was one that wasn't so steep that we could get over this saddle. And then we came down the other side and down, and the boats met us on the other side, which was nice because it's rare that in a canyon that you're not doing an out and back. So that was really cool. It was a point to point. Plus you got up there and the view was spectacular. I think that was only about a 600-foot gain. So it was some climbing and some descending, but nothing crazy. I think the length wasn't more than 3 miles. So that was really nice. So a lot of different hiking. We would stop for lunch midday, and that was always a moment to really, they get out and they make sandwiches and salads and all kinds of stuff, and we could relax and swim or whatever we wanted to. We did that. We'd sometimes stop for another hike in the afternoon if we were in the right place. And then we would stop and make camp. And even though I know I kind of mentioned at one point that, the food is luxurious and we get to bring a lot of stuff along, it's still, roughing it, and you are expected to help for sure. So once we land at a camp, we all help kind of do a little fire line drill and unload all the boats with all the gear. And the guests then put up their own tents, get everything in their tent situated. And then the guides all start immediately putting up the kitchen and making food again. And that process normally lasts a while. We have at camp, you can play bocce ball, there's horseshoes, you can just sit and read, you can swim. So it's that's what I mean when I said at the beginning, it's like 6 beautiful days of being outside. It's relaxing in a way, even though you're going through some very stressful rapids those last 2 days and you are hiking. It's still, I find it to be a really beautiful, relaxing way to travel.
So tell us about the company you went with, O.A.R.S. I know they've got a great reputation. What did you think of them?
So O.A.R.S, the company I went with, is really known for their food and the cooking that the guides do. It is amazing, some of the meals that we had. So first of all, like the first morning, even, I think we had pancakes, sausage, bacon. There's no better way to wake up than the smell of bacon, I think, cooking in camp. That's always my favorite thing. But I mean, like they could do everything for breakfast. We had omelets. Then there was also, of course, yogurt and fruit and all that kind of stuff. For lunches, we normally had salads and sandwiches. For dinners, man, it was amazing. We'd have, we kind of had your traditional hamburgers and hot dogs one night, but don't think that that's every night. I mean, other nights we had fish, all kinds of beautiful fish dishes, lasagna. They bring Dutch ovens. And so they can actually do a bunch of baking, obviously, there. And they're very good at it. So like you can have lasagna, breads. We had steak one night. You do not go hungry whatsoever. And then you can even they make cakes. Like we had warm brownies one night. We had like an upside down pineapple cake. And that's all made in the Dutch oven. So it is pretty spectacular. The other thing is you bring your own alcohol. So however much you think you're going to drink, you can purchase beforehand, and then they just put it in the coolers and it comes down the river with you. So that makes it pretty easy. One of the first things, we'd all do is get our tents set up and then come back around the chair circle and have drinks and talk about the day and look at pictures and so on. So it was really great. And I know I mentioned earlier, this is a really great trip for solo travelers. It is because you don't have any kind of single supplement, first of all, and that's rare. So I went as a single. My price is the same as every other individual. I get my own tent. If you go as a couple and you share a tent, you don't get a cheaper price. It's all the same. It's per person, which is nice. The other thing is, this trip, I think we had 20 guests on it total and 6 guides. So it was quite a entourage coming down the river. But the nice thing is, as a solo traveler, everything then, once you kind of get into camp, is communal. And so you can sit and meet people and talk to people, but you still have your own tent. You're not paying extra. I just find it to be a really fun social trip. That's how I felt about it in the Grand Canyon when I did it. I also did that solo too. I mean, I bonded with all of these people with our group. It's really easy as a solo traveler. I mean, it's social, definitely. It would be hard to be an introvert, I think. But also, if you want to go do your own thing, you can. If you want to just sit and camp and read, you can do that too. And you don't even have to really have a lot of camping equipment because they provide all the camping equipment. They provide tents as part of the cost. You can rent a sleeping bag and a mat from them, or you can bring your own. I brought my own. And then they also give you dry bags, which you obviously need on a rafting trip. You get a great big dry bag to put your personal stuff in, which you don't need much. I mean, it's 6 days, you're outside all the time, you're wet, you need some hiking shoes and some like water shoes, and that's it. But they provide the gear bags, which is really nice. And like I said, they will also provide a sleeping bag and a pad if you want. But otherwise, they bring everything else. You just bring your clothes, your shoes, if you need hiking poles, anything like that. Sunscreen, lots of sunscreen. They also provide, because it's the Canyonlands, it's very hot. They also provide like Gatorade powder and lemonade powder. They provide all the water, obviously, but they provide those powders, obviously, so you can put it in your bottles every day. Oh, they also give you a really nice thermal mug so you can put water or coffee in it, whatever you want throughout the day. It's really quite easy. You don't have to make a huge investment beyond just the cost of the trip itself.
Tell us a little bit about your group. Like, what kinds of people went on this trip?
So our group was really kind of a hodgepodge of people. It was interesting. There were a couple of girlfriends traveling together. There was a family traveling, but older family, obviously. It was all adults, but a brother, sister, father, and then the father's friends. And then there were two couples. Everyone really came from such different backgrounds. It was really neat. We had some doctors. We had some like scientists. It was really cool. And that's what I mean by it's such a great solo trip, because you go sit by someone new every night at the camp, or you take a different boat every day and you learn about what they do and all of that. I just thought that kind of thing is really great. And after a year and a half of dealing with the pandemic and really just kind of being very insular, I think these kind of trips are even more fun because you get that chance to be social again with strangers, which is something I haven't been able to do for a long time.
So what made you choose oars to go with?
So I went with oars again on the Cataract Canyon because they were so good on the Grand Canyon. They really are, I think, one of the best rafting companies out there for sure. Our guides were very skilled. Obviously, I put them to the test with my rescue without a doubt. And the other thing is, I remember when we were going through some of the big drops, they would kind of position me in a place where I could take pictures of the boats coming through. And I remember thinking when I was looking at those pictures, how cool it was to see the guests all have these big smiles. When you crop in on the guide, they are so concentrated, like they are all business, when they're going through the rapids. So very, very skilled. All of our guides had been on this river a number of times for sure. And they had all been with oars for multiple years. And that's what you'll find a lot with the oars guides, I think.
How were they about letting you know what you're getting yourself in for, giving you a pre-trip checklist, that kind of thing?
As far as all of the pre-trip stuff, they send out multiple emails before to make sure you've got all the right gear. That there's also, a whole bunch of kind of COVID questions, of course. That's kind of forever changing because it's all starting to loosen up. When we started, we actually had to wear masks when we got dinner and stuff like that at the camp. But as we were on the water, I think that policy even changed. So they'll keep you up to date on what the recent policy is on all of that stuff. But I thought they did a really nice job. Also give you ideas of like pre-reading and things like that. Very responsive as far as if you have questions of like, should I bring this or do I need that? The logistics of the trip was really great. In fact, one of the highlights that I didn't even mention is, we put right in at Moab. So they have a warehouse. O.A.R.S has a warehouse in Moab. Everyone meets there. They give us all your bags and your tent and your sleeping gear and all that kind of stuff. And you pack it all into the dry bags. You leave whatever valuables at the O.A.R.S warehouse that you have, or in your car. I left my car parked there. And you get in at Moab and float for 6 days. And when you take out right at the beginning of Lake Powell, then you have a 10-minute van ride to a runway, and it is just a runway. There's no building, just a runway. And then you end up flying back to Moab, and the flight's only about 35 minutes. But one of the coolest highlights is that after you've spent 6 days traveling down this river and through this canyon from a very kind of deep perspective, then you get on a little plane, you fly back to Moab, and you fly right over the top of everywhere you just came. I mean, it would have been a spectacular ride regardless, but because you're so connected, and I could look down, like we went right over the rapids, you could see the rapids, which look so tiny and small and insignificant, but down there, they're huge. In a plane, they're just They look like nothing. Same thing is like we could see our camping spot at the confluence. You could see the confluence from above and how the Green River and the Colorado River come together and the different color of water even. I loved that part. I loved being able to fly back. And then you just get bussed back to the warehouse and can pick up your stuff. So they make it the logistics part really easy.
So you mentioned you were on the adult trip and they also have family trips. Can you talk a little bit about the different ways they kind of categorize, or maybe I should say theme their different trips?
O.A.R.S actually offers a few different kind of specialized trips. One of them that I mentioned, obviously the adult trip. I think they also offer an astronomy trip, which would be spectacular. I don't know if they have like a photographer along for that or not. I would hope so, but I'm not sure, because the night sky pictures that you can get camping is really, really insane. Most nights you could see the Milky Way. There was no rain whatsoever. We had lots of wind, but no rain. So nice, clear skies. It's a beautiful place to be. It was just really fun. And we actually probably, I think, the last trip that we're allowed to have campfires, like an actual campfire. I think since then there's been a fire ban, which makes sense. But if there's not a fire ban, you can sit around the campfire. Our guide also played guitar. Not that all guides play guitar, but ours did. And so we would sit around the campfire at night and have music and sing. And it was great. And the stars were beautiful. So very relaxing.
So you mentioned the weather. How about the temperatures?
The temperatures were hot. I'm going to say that. There's just no getting around it. All of that area, Moab, Canyonlands, Grand Canyon, Lake Powell, in the summer, it's really freaking hot. And so the beauty of this is, yes, it was, I think the whole week we were on the river in early June, the first week of June, it was already in the high 90s every day. So it would kind of start off pretty pleasant in the morning. And then by the afternoon after lunch, it was hot. But the beauty of this is you can jump in to 65, 68 degree water and float and cool off really fast. Well, you could do that for part of the Grand Canyon if you obviously weren't by rapids, but jumping into 48 degree or 50 degree water, you don't stay long in there. But at Cataract Canyon, we just put on your life vests and you just float, and it was wonderful.
And I imagine you're pretty much off the grid.
And of course, you're in a canyon, so there is no cell phone service, which makes it even better because you're completely disconnected, which I think everyone needs to do every once in a while. And obviously no electricity. You need to make sure you bring a headlamp or something. I obviously was there working at the same time. So doing a lot of content capturing. So I had my cameras and my phone. I just put it in airplane mode. And then it's amazing how long the battery lasts when you're in airplane mode. But I just took like a power brick to recharge it, I think once or twice during the trip. So that's all possible, and bring extra batteries or ways to charge. A lot of people brought solar chargers for their batteries, and that's also a really good way to do it.
What, if anything, do you wish you had known before you went?
I think the one thing I wish I would have known ahead of time, and actually I should say, I knew this, I just forgot it. And upon forgetting it, I realized again how important it is. And that is bring a pashmina. I can't believe I forgot it, because I remember in the Grand Canyon thinking, this is the best thing ever. Some sort of like light cotton fabric, pashmina is great, that you can dunk in the water and then just drape over you like a blanket. That is the best way to stay cool. Obviously hats that you can also dunk in the water, or neck gaiters and that kind of stuff. I honestly stayed covered up pretty much the whole time. I wear a long sleeve cotton shirt that I would dunk in the water and put back on. So all of that stuff is really important. I can't believe I forgot the pashmina though.
When you look back on your trip, what memory or favorite story first comes to mind?
So I think when I look back at this trip, definitely the story that I'll tell is without a doubt my own kayak ride where I tipped over. Definitely the thing that's the most memorable to me and meaningful to me, mainly just because, like I said, it was a way of challenging myself and feeling more confident and stronger because of it. However, I think the other things that I'll remember is really just the uniqueness of being able to be in the middle of Cataract Canyon on a stand-up paddleboard, just paddling down the Colorado River. You feel really remote and you feel very small. And it's just such a kind of a neat way to travel, like the uniqueness of being able to do that in that river so far away from any civilization is really special, I think.
What advice would you give us if we're considering this adventure?
So if you're considering doing this adventure, I would just say one of the things is, and this is probably obvious, but be ready for the fact that you're going to have to use a toilet in the wild for 6 days, but it's not as hard as you think. So do not freak out about that. In fact, I did like a whole story on what they call the groover, and the groover is kind of the toilet system that you use on these multi-day raft trips. All urine, number one, all goes into the river. So you basically pee in the river. And that is because you might think that's weird, but you do that because if you pee on the land, the problem is they don't get much rain there. And so the whole place would just be gross, honestly. Like all the campsites would be gross if you let people do that. So, and it's the same as in the Grand Canyon. You go in the river. However, number two, they have a couple of groovers set up at camp. And these are kind of like portable, very simple portable toilets, but there is actually a toilet seat on it. So it's not uncomfortable at all. They have a whole way that like they hide it away in the prettiest spots. And I tell you what, you will never see a more beautiful toilet spot than when you're on a rafting trip. The views are spectacular. And they kind of have a whole system for how you know if it's busy or not, even though you don't have doors, obviously. So it's all really easy. So don't let that intimidate you. That's one thing I would say to someone who is considering it. Even if you haven't camped a lot, this is still fairly easy camping. I mean, they're doing all the hard work by carrying all of the gear in the boats and rowing the boats. All you got to do is put up a tent. And it's not very intimidating, I would say. If you wanted to try out camping, this is a really nice way to do it.
So when you're out there, do you feel like you're the only ones out there, or do you see other rafters?
We saw probably maybe one other rafting company, but they maybe only had one or two rafts. Like I said, we had 6 and 26 people. I think O.A.R.S is definitely one of the biggest operators in the Cataract Canyon. And then we saw some individuals, but like I think we saw an individual one that had a little rubber raft with a motor. And then they were also carrying a proper like whitewater kayak, and they were going through the rapids. But other than that, we didn't see many people at all. That's one of the nice things about these trips.
We've talked about your group and the guides in passing, but tell us a little bit more about the guides.
I would just say one of the things that really sets O.A.R.S apart is the quality of their guides on both the trips that I've taken with them. These guides are so passionate, and they could be doing other things. This isn't like, a ski bum or something like that. It's just, they love being on the water, and they love this environment, and they love rafting. And I think no one works harder than the guides. They're constantly taking care of you. They don't have really a moment of time to themselves for 6 days. And then they've got to, you don't even have to pick up and clean up everything. You get out of the rafts and they whisk you off to a plane, and they've got to break everything down. So I'm always amazed at how hard they work and how much they love their job. I think it's always fun to see people like that.
Sherry, I mentioned your blog briefly in the introduction. How about telling us a little bit more about you?
And you can find me and this story at ottsworld.com. You can also follow me, and I've saved some highlights on at ottsworld, OTTSWORLD, in like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that jazz. And if you like adventure and you like to challenge yourself, I actually am doing, this is the second time I've done it, an Ottsworld women's surf and yoga retreat in El Salvador. In addition to challenging myself with kayaking, I've also been trying to challenge myself with surfing. I mean, I'm 51, so taking up new sports in middle age is always really interesting, but I think it's also very rewarding. So if you've ever wanted to learn how to surf, we have a whole like secluded beach to ourselves in El Salvador. There's obviously cultural elements there too that we tour around, but it's mainly surfing a couple times a day with incredible female instructors and yoga a couple times a day with a beach and a little boutique hotel all to ourselves. So if you're interested in that, I run those tours. Just head to my website. And then also, if you're there, make sure you download my free ebook, which is Where to Go and When. I give you 3 ideas of where to go every month of the year based on my own 15 years of travel that I've been doing.
And if you're driving, don't worry, I'm going to have all these links in the show notes. So be sure to either scroll down your phone if you're listening on your phone, or just go to activetravelaadventures.com. And in the search bar, just put Raft, Canyonlands. Actually, either one of those words, it should pop up. Many thanks to Sherry for once again coming on the program. I told you at the beginning that this was probably the most difficult recording I have done to date in the almost 4 years I've been putting on this show. I'm on the road. I never have cell service, and particularly when I've been up north in the northern Midwest. So on the day that Sherry and I were supposed to chat, I made a point of heading to a town. I sat around town all day trying to find a signal. I would get 2 bars here, 3 bars there, and I finally found this quiet residential area where I had 3 bars. I parked my van. The interview's about to start on Zoom, and then the man decides it's time to mow his yard. So now I've got like 3 minutes to go before Sherry's going to get on the phone, and I'm driving around trying to find some place to get a signal, and all I could find is 2 bars where I don't have any noise. So we get through. We're chatting, it's breaking up, she can't hear me. So finally, I'm typing in the chat box some keywords and some questions. And so Sherry and I did not speak for virtually 98% of this episode. And so to edit it, I had to go back, listen to her answer to figure out what the question was. And then to record my voice, I have to find a quiet place outside, because if I record from within the van, you get this echoey, hollowy noise that I can't stand, that I think you would find annoying. And on the day that I went and put in the questions, I had lost my voice. So that's why my voice sounds really weak today. I was doing the final listen through, and so I can speak a little bit better now. But it was quite the production. It's been a lot of fun. Hopefully you weren't able to tell the difference, but I want you to hear what Sherry said when I finally typed, "I think we're finished." Thanks so much, Sherry.
This was the craziest interview ever, Kit. I don't know if you're going to be able to pull this together or not. Does it? I'm like, I don't know. Oh, I hope I didn't make it too hard for you to edit. Of course, now I can hear you, but I think also it gets a little backed up and it slows down. I don't know. Who knows? But that is hilarious. Oh my God, I love it.
And I love that Sherry was such a great sport. I'm going to make a point to do this adventure the next time I go out west. I always thought the Colorado through the Grand Canyon was too long of a trip for me. This is just the right amount of time. I love it. It's just under a week. You've also got the activities of doing the different hiking. So this is a perfect trip for me. So I sure plan on doing it. And I hope you feel the same. I hope you've enjoyed today's show. Please take a minute to share this with your friends on your favorite social channels, via email, or in person if you're hanging out. Word of mouth is how most people find out about podcasts. And for independents like me, it's really hard to break through the clutter when there's over 1 million podcasts out there. And unlike the big guys, I have no staff or advertising budget to help get the word out. So I'm counting on you. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on!